Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag Gamble, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's a huge pleasure to share this conversation with you today. I'm talking with a leading regenerative farmer here in Australia, Stuart Andrews. Stuart has dedicated 30 years to understanding, practicing and teaching land rehabilitation techniques. With his family, he runs forage farms up here near me in the Sunshine Coast. Actually, he says his 2 sons, Lockie and Hamish, run it mostly. And he also runs Tarwin Park training, sharing natural sequence farming techniques around the country. Stuart was raised actually on the 1,500-acre Tarwin Park farm, the home of natural sequence farming pioneered by his father, Peter Andrews, who was an awarded Order of Australia Medal for this work. And natural sequence farming is internationally recognised as a significant innovation in farm restoration and sustainability. The focus is on rehydration of the landscapes, on healing the land from the patterns of destruction and disturbance that have taken place, and also by farming differently. In this conversation, we talk about how natural sequence farming restores the land with common sense, accessible strategies, so important in this decade of ecosystems restoration. And we also talk about how it perfectly dovetails with permaculture. Essentially, natural sequence farming is about how to restore food systems, landscape health, health of the community while creating resilient and ecologically restored farms. I hope you enjoy this conversation just as much as I did. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Stuart. It's just such a delight to have you on this show. I know you were pegged to speak at the Australian Permaculture Conference last year that got cancelled with COVID, and then it's happening this year again, but I don't know, it's sort of a little bit to and fro, but I was looking forward to catching up with you again there at the conference, but I don't think you're going to be there either. But we did meet a few months ago at a regenerative farming event in Gympie. And I was it just made me really delighted to hear all the things that you've been doing. And I've been wanting for a long time to catch up with you and have this conversation to see where those links are between permaculture and the work you do in natural sequence farming, but also more just to really hear more about what natural sequence farming is so that we can share throughout this global permaculture movement, because the work that you're doing is, like, you're a globally recognized regenerative farmer, and the work that you're doing is phenomenal. So I thought maybe we could just begin at a little bit of a point about what inspires you first to be in this game of trying to change what's happening in the farming system. Like, where does that come from for you?
I don't know, it helps to be a mild lunatic, I suppose. That would be partly to do with my upbringing, I guess. My father, Peter Andrews, it all started with him, obviously. And so I guess there's a degree of passion that comes from that side. But through my years of farming, I could see where our stumbling blocks are, where things are just not working for farmers. And a big part of that is the fact that we spend most of our time fighting nature rather than working with it. And natural sequence farming is all about working with nature, understanding how nature functions, and then utilising that function to the best of our ability so that we can produce a product which in the end makes the farmer more profitable. So I guess I'm driven in a way to be able to help people. That's what I like to do. I like to be able to help people. But I got two boys of my own, and they work with us in our farming operation. In actual fact, they run one of the farms for us, and so their future is beholden upon us understanding how our landscape works, so that we can continue to do this. At the moment, everywhere I drive around, I see landscapes going backwards, and that's been the case now for more than 100 years, probably 150 years or more. And so we have to look differently at how we go to farm so that we are no longer destroying, that we are building. And regenerative is the new buzzword. If you had said to me regenerative 3 years ago, I wouldn't have known what you were talking about, because it was never a thing. We've always spoken about degrade and upgrade. And we've always been about upgrading, which is, I guess, what the term regenerative is supposed to mean. It does mean different things to different people. So, it's probably got a little bit of conjecture there as to what it is. But
that's really interesting. So just tell me a little bit more then about that degrade and upgrade. So that's what you've been using for decades, obviously. So yep. What's the key thing of grading a farm, if that's a word? Like, what would you describe that as?
It's about building a system. So it's about building. Everything is building onto itself. So let's talk about plants. Let's say we have a thistle comes into an area and it grows, and from there the thistle builds that system, builds the soil so that the next plant can come in and take its place. So it's an aggrading system. It's an ever-aggrading system. So it's about understanding what do we need to do to get our system to constantly build. So that's always aggrading.
I'm glad that you used the thistle example, because the thistle is something that, depending on your perspective, you would look at quite differently when you see it in a field. So some people want to just go and kind of take it out. But what role does a thistle play for you in your farming system? How do you see a thistle?
Well, it's a primary colonising plant. It's a plant that's coming in to do a job. Every plant, doesn't matter what it is, every plant does a job, and depending on what job it's got to play determines what plant comes next, and that plant tells you what happened before. So, the thistle comes in if the ground has been compacted and it needs a chance to have a rest. So the thistle comes in to do that job. Any plant that grows prickles is telling you to keep out, or animals to keep out. That's why it grows prickles. So there's three things. They'll grow a tannin, a poison, or a prickle. All of them are about maintaining their position in that ecosystem today, whilst they build, whilst they grade and change the condition and create that successional change. So, every plant, doesn't matter what it is, every plant is playing a role. The thing about the thistle, or any plants that have got prickles, when you talk about the dew or the small water cycle, dew forms on the points of plants. The more points you have on a plant, the more dew that plant has the ability to attract. That means you are now building the small water cycle much faster because you've got a plant that's able to capture more moisture out of the atmosphere. So, the big thing about thistles or any weeds is that they're taking moisture away from other plants, generally grass-type plants if you're a cropper or grazier. But in actual fact, it's the reverse, because those plants live off the atmosphere. They don't even need to worry about the soil. The thing about it is that they'll, people will use the analysis of, they've got 5 thistles in their paddock, and so those thistles are taking moisture away. Where in actual fact, it's the fact that there's no other plants around them that the moisture is evaporating. It's not the thistle. No. You'll find underneath the thistle has moist soil and earthworms and biology all working. So the poor old thistle is just trying to keep the thing going, trying to keep the landscape alive, whilst everywhere around it is dying.
So this whole kind of concept then of the natural sequence farming, so that you're talking about what in permaculture we explore as natural succession. And it's looking at working towards a more cultivated ecosystem where it's very much applied systems thinking. It's looking at how we can, exactly like as you said, work with nature to create systems that are thriving and alive. Now, there's something very particular about the approach that you're taking, that you're focusing so much, like it's led by, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's led by the understanding of this water cycle, of getting those water cycles happening and rehydrating the landscape. And then once that happens, then the soil systems come alive and the ecosystems come alive and things shift with that. Is that right? If I said that right?
Yeah. So I guess, a question that I'm sure you will ask at some point will be, what's the difference, say, between, or what do I see the difference between natural sequence farming and permaculture? The key difference that I see is that natural sequence farming is just looking at how did this Australian landscape function prior to any human interference, Aboriginal or whitefellow. So we go out, we read the landscape, and we look for the key components that were there that built this landscape prior to any of that interference. So what we then go about doing is we reconnect those systems, the hydrology that existed prior to any human interference. And then this is where permaculture comes in. Permaculture comes in with the food production system that you can overlay onto that, as does a number of other things, whether it's holistic grazing or whatever. But it's understanding first and foremost how this landscape functions. And because Australia is the oldest continent, the oldest, driest continent on this earth, it is the blueprint for every other continent on the earth, because it survived for so long without the services of major rivers, which it lost once it separated from Antarctica, and it's lost the snow-capped hills or the ice-capped hills that slowly fed it nutrients and water. It lost that 600 million years ago. So it's had to devise a system of limiting its losses. And it did that through what we are saying is this natural sequence. So it's a natural sequence of events. How did it manage to do that? And what it did was everything that stimulated the next cycle was a rain event. So the rain event might have been just a one-off rain event, or the big rain event that came after a long dry. And that's the thing that stimulated the change or created that sequence. And the sequence was a rain event, a flourish of plants that came in to rebuild the system and reboot it. And then the hydrology that followed after that is what built the next succession of plants, and so it goes. So, yeah, I think that's how I explain it to people anyway that do our course, that what we are looking at doing is rebuilding or putting back the skeleton of what existed prior to any human interference. So we go back, 60 or 80,000 years potentially, and we're looking at how did the landscape, how did it function back then? How do we get that same function to work today, even though it's in a very much degraded state? Mm-hmm. And it's as simple as no water, no fresh water left this landscape without servicing plants on its way through. Today, it barely services any plants. It just goes out to sea. Well, it was never like that. And so what's the big change? Well, some of the change is loss of vegetation, loss of our forests, introduction of hard-hoofed animals that are detrimental to the landscape and do cause compaction if not managed correctly with plants, and all of those, which is what happened 200 years ago. Not understanding this landscape and how it worked caused all of those problems. So now we've got water rushing into these now eroded gullies and eroded creek lines and running away. And every time that water moves, it's carrying our fertility with it, all of our soluble nutrients, and worst case scenario, the sediments, which are our long-term fertility. It's all taking it to the ocean, which is then destroying the ocean in turn because it's overloading it with all this nutrient that there is not the plant life to be able to filter it anymore. So how do we go about minimising the loss, understanding that will still happen no matter what? So long as we continue to farm the way we farm and or run the hard-hoofed animals, it's still going to be a problem we're going to face because the plants that were here on settlement could not and cannot overcome the damage that the hard-hoofed animals do. Mm-hmm. Now, when you go back to the thistle and you say, where does the thistle fit in? The thistle, a number of them, fit in by overcoming the damage the animals do. So they are great at breaking up the soil if it becomes compacted, but they're also great at keeping the animals out of that area. That's why they've got spikes, keeping them out so the whole system can rebuild and reboot. So those plants came here as nature's solver of the problem of the introduced animals. And the fact that, people go around and say, oh, it's not native, so we can't have it. It's very, very frustrating because we need to have those plants to overcome the animals that we've introduced. So we can't go and say, oh, well, we'll just introduce these things. We'll introduce the humans. We'll introduce the animals, but we don't want any of the plants. Sorry, no, we want to keep everything natural. No, it doesn't work that way. That's gone, long gone. We've got to look at building ecological communities, which involves all of these introduced plants and the native ones together.
So there's so many different things that I want to ask you based on that. One of them is, so firstly, how do you reboot this system? Like, what are some of the strategies that you put in place? Another one is also, so I might just start with two and you can weave them together however you like. The other one is you're talking about hard-hoofed animals, and this is a key part of the farming landscape throughout Australia. So that's like such a big one to start to unpack because it's about our diet, it's about consumer choices, it's about export markets, about economic systems. Like, where do we go with that conversation? If part of the conversation about healing this landscape and changing what's happening is about the hard-hoofed animals, what's your take on how we move forward with that?
That is the beautiful part, I think, about natural sequence farming, or you can call it whatever you like, but it's nature really, is that if we understand the key components that the animals did damage to and can do damage to, we know now the areas that specifically need protection from said animals, whether it be limit the amount of time they can be there or exclude them, altogether, which is not generally a great way to go about it. But it's about understanding that they do damage, hiding behind it and saying, oh, no, they don't do any damage, that's a falsehood, because they do. And the other part is that for it to work, we are now reliant on a human. The most unreliable species on this planet are humans. So, I base it on, if we're going to rely entirely on the humans to solve this problem, then we are really going to be in trouble, because some people are really good, some people not so good. So we've got to work with that. So what do we do? So the first thing we do is we look for the components in the landscape that allowed this landscape to function extremely well prior to the introduction of the animals and the people. And they're these steppes, these wetland systems, these stepped landscapes where there'd be pockets where water was restricted, the ability for that water to flow off of that landscape was restricted, and as a result, sedimentation took place, plants grew there, and then the plants managed how the water moved off of the landscape. We call those steppes. And so the first thing we do is I look for where were those steppes located, and that might be looking in the eroded channel today. You can see where the steppes are trying to form again. And a steppe is simple. For any of your listeners, if you walk along a creek when there's water there, and you'll see there's a pond of water, and then it might be dry or a trickle, and then another pond of water, where it's dry and or the trickle, that's the steppe. Mm-hmm. So the steppe is creating the pond. The pond is the dissipator of the energy of the water coming in behind it. So the pond is critical at dissipating the energy so the system doesn't continue to break down. Those steppes are the components that the animals destroy. Cattle, particularly, always like to walk over that part of your flow line, right where the steppe is. And that causes it to break down. Next flow that comes through has the potential now to damage it if it doesn't have the vegetation there to hold it together. So then that's looking at the gully itself. Once upon a time, that gully, that steppe, was linked to the same steppe on the ridgeline. And that's the real key part. So what we're looking to do is this is the old dinosaur skeleton we're trying to put back together. So we're taking the head, which we see in the gully, the steppe, and we're joining it back to its feet with its body out on the ridgeline. So now some of the water, instead of water and nutrients flowing down the gully, they now move out to the ridgeline where the water can move from a high point, the water and fertility moves from a high point, and our landscape's able to build from that point. So now what we're looking at is a contoured system. So if we're going to protect an area, it's that contoured system. Everywhere above, everywhere below is able to be utilised for our farming system, whatever it might be, whether we're cropping, grazing, doesn't matter. And the contour is the rejig. It's the reboot. Every time we have a rain event, the contour system starts the process. So it starts the hydrology, it kickstarts the hydrology, and it's managing the fertility so it doesn't leave the landscape. And then the next component is, this is the toughest one for me to get farmers to do, that is that they should harvest their material from the bottom of their system and take it back up to the top. And by doing that, they've now lost nothing. But currently, everything just flows out to sea and we bring nothing back. But if we can harvest the material that grows at the bottom, what we would call the filtration area of our landscape, if you can harvest that material that grows there, which may be the creek lines, might be the gullies. If you can harvest that material, take it back to the top of the hill, the numbers we talk about is you've saved yourself 1,000 years. It would have taken 1,000 years for that same amount of biomass to be moved by animals back to the top of the hill. So it's just so powerful if we can get our head around it. And, I'd think about things on a broader landscape type field. But if you were in a garden and you were going to do a permaculture garden, then you set up exactly the same system, but your contours might be 5 metres apart. They might be 30 centimetres apart. And all you do is whatever you grow at the bottom of your 30 centimetres, at the end of the year, you take it back and you put it on top of what would be the mountain, the contour above that. There you go. You've lost nothing.
Yep.
And you rebuilt built the system.
So I came across Martin down near Maloon Farm when I was down there, and he was telling me about this, the incised creeks, how we've got millions of kilometres of incised creeks throughout Australia. And he was saying that he's actually using his animals to try and batter back the slopes. Because I'd always had this thing like, we don't let animals into the creek. You don't let them because they do the damage, like what you were saying. You're saying as part of his repair strategy, just in little sections, to actually let them in to batter back so then things can actually start to grow there. And then as they're munching, he takes them, they go up to the top, sit up on the top. So is that something that works? Like, it's a short-term strategy of using animals to it blew my mind thinking about this possibility, because you sort of think, oh, well, I'll just keep everything out of that system, protect it. I don't know. Is that a useful strategy, using animals to do that, or would you rather do it more with, putting logs and brush and all sorts of things in it? What's the technique of actually kickstarting a system that is so degraded that it just really needs rapid transformation?
Well, of course, I wasn't there when you had the conversation with Martin. He may well have said this, or he may not have. I don't know. But on his particular place, I'm assuming you were on Gillimatong at the time, he has put in structures in there. So the structures are already creating the steps. The animals, no matter what you do, can never create that. The animals will never recreate that stepping system. So unfortunately, because we are in the position we're in today, that needs to be done with some sort of mechanical use. It may be small, it may be large. It would vary depending on how badly damaged the system is. The animals that he's talking about, I'm assuming that he takes them down in and he lets them graze the area above the pond but below the step. Yeah. And then he moves them back up, so they'll come down, they'll get a rumen full, because he's a cattle man, they'll get a rumen full of feed. Then he sends them back to the top where they ruminate. They would have water up there and shade, and then they deliver that material in the way we know them to do out their back end. And so that is a transfer of fertility. That is definitely a better way than what is currently happening, which mostly is the cattle spend all of their time in the lowest part of the landscape, being the gully or the creek, and that's where they deliver all that stuff out the back end into there, which is a definite negative. If the system is that system as beneficial to your land, as beneficial as moving it, the answer is no. And I'll tell you why. For every 1 ton of material we move from the bottom to the top, we now have the ability to hold 5 times that weight in water. Mm-hmm. So now we are holding more water and fertility in the highest part of our landscape. Unfortunately, the cow has no ability to do that. The cow has the ability to transfer nutrients, and then providing we've got a system working, we've got dung beetles bearing it, that's all fantastic. Don't get me wrong. That's all fantastic, but that should only be a part of our fix, because we've got such degraded landscapes that we can't afford to wait for the cow to transport it back up there. It's just going to take way too long.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to use something a little better. PA would probably, as in Peter Andrews, my dad, he would say, that's a crock of shit. That's what he'd say. He doesn't agree with that. But I'm different in that I do understand that people have to get it, particularly, farmers, graziers have to be able to get it comfortably in their head that if they have to bring a machine in to pick that material up and move it up to there, that it's going to be beneficial. Particularly, the farmers that are, holistic managers or, guys that are thinking like that, they probably want to limit the amount of machinery that they utilise because of the cost associated with it. But all I would say is you just need to trial it. Just trial it for yourself, and then you can determine whether you think it's of worth to your system or not. Even if it was to the point of, let's say you were going to feed some cattle over winter for whatever reason, feed them at the top of the hill and then look at the results. I mean, farmers have been doing this for years. Most of the time they feed them at the bottom of the hill, not the top. They always end up with the best quality feed growing the year after or 2 years after in that particular site. But I don't know that we put two and two together. If we do it at the top of the hill, then gravity is carrying that fertility over our entire place and it never cost us a cent.
Yeah, and it's just good common sense, really, isn't it, this? But it's like what you're saying, it's taking the time to make the connections between the different aspects, and that's that kind of that meta thinking and the process that you're using. Because that does just make so much sense, doesn't it? When you hear it, it makes sense, but you have to kind of sometimes point it out for that common sense to be seen.
There is nothing in natural sequence farming, nothing that we talk about that you can't see as an example in the landscape today. You can see how that works. You can see it working. That's what I think is so powerful. It's not a dreamed up idea. It's not Peter Andrews' idea. It was his ability, working with other people as well along the way, learning how the landscape functioned. Then the key part is, how do we fit our farming systems into that functioning landscape? That's what's important. Because if it's just about piecing the landscape together and the farmer's not going to make money, well, I'm sorry, there's not too many farmers out there today that are going to take that on. That's the thing, though. If we get our hydration working, we stop losing our fertility, we don't need to spend anywhere near the money that we're spending today on any of the other components of running a farm, the chemicals, the artificial fertilizers, none of those things. Because the only reason we're having to add those things on is because we keep flushing everything away. So we go back to the key components that we talk about. Water, I think you asked me this question. I probably didn't answer it, but water is either our friend or our foe. If we don't manage it, it is our foe, because it carries away all of our fertility and potentially our soil if it's not managed correctly. If it's our friend, then we need to look at how do we manage it? How do we pacify the water that flows across our landscape? And that was once done by plants. It didn't need any human interference. Anything done by a human was not necessary. But we've now got a dysfunctional landscape. So we must intervene the correct way to help get it, to manage the high velocity water that we've now got carrying everything away.
So can I just ask you then about, I got an echo then. So in the droughts that we just had a little while ago, what did you notice that was happening differently on the natural sequence farms? And on the flip side of that, we have floods in various locations. What happens in or after a flood event on a natural sequence farm that's different from conventional farms? Maybe just for our listeners, if you could kind of describe sort of those extreme events and where you see natural sequence farming bringing benefit.
What I'll do is I'll go back and I'll give you an example. And the example was Tarwin Park, where PA began doing his trial work, and the property that Megan and I ran for 15 years. So we had, I think about 3/4 of the property was what would be determined as floodplain country, and the rest of it was hill. Maybe it was 70% floodplain, and the rest of it was hill type country. Big, massive watersheds. A watershed that went for 40 kilometres further up, so that when there was a big rain event, a lot of water came down. But that landscape, the floodplain, never hydrated. The water would flow through within a week, 2 weeks, it's gone, and the floodplain was still empty. So what PA did was he set about managing some of that water. You can't manage all of it because it's too much, but managing some of it and getting it back to rehydrate that landscape whilst that excess water was moving through that system. And so that had the ability then to recharge the floodplain as well as on the slopes, not just the floodplain, but the slopes at the same time. But the floodplain had the ability to hold more water because it had an aquifer system or had the potential for an aquifer system underneath it. So what would happen is that system would recharge in a flood event, which always follows the drought, funnily enough. And so the system would rebuild. And when you're moving into the next dry period, then what I found in my management of that property is we were usually 2 years behind anybody else suffering from the dry conditions. I mean, I guess some of that came down to management too. Some of my management was different. I would start selling off livestock long before, the time came to do that. But I mean, that's all part of understanding the landscape and knowing the sign to tell you that you're going into a dry period. So you make these decisions. But yeah, so it was, I'll give you an example of the drought of 2002, which was considered to be a pretty bad one. So in 1999, 2000, we had a wet season. Because Tarwin Park was functioning correctly, the floodplain was hydrated. In 2002, 2 years into the drought, if people go back to their records, they will find out that in 2002, they were talking about this being worse than the millennium drought. So it was a pretty harsh drought. In 2002, can't remember what time of the year it was, but it was either spring, it was late summer, February, that's right. John Anderson, who was a Deputy Prime Minister at the time, came to Tarwin Park to see what PA had been banging on about. And he was standing in clover up to his knees, white clover in summer, on this floodplain that was still hydrated from 2 years prior and still highly productive. By 2006, we were starting to see the effects of the dry. That was 6 years after the last event. The dry finished in 2008, I think it was, 2010. Probably started about 2008. By 2010, we had floods. So for most of that dry period, it was insulated as a result. The hills, yes, the hills had dried back. You'd expect that. But that's the way the system worked. The low areas should have always been holding the most amount of water, the most amount of fertility, but they don't even function anymore. So that gives you a bit of an idea as to how much it can change your farming operation. On the hills, you've probably got 2 years, maybe 3. On the lower areas, 6 years, maybe more. Most of your dry periods or this sequence of event is over 10 years. So you'll see that for a period of it, it's dry, for a period it's wet, and for a period it's stable. Now, this is where the difference is. It used to be big length of time stable, short period of time dry, short period of time excessively wet. Now, which way is it? Massive time dry, short period stable, and a really short period wet. That's how things have changed. And so that's the hydrological cycle has changed so much. It's so broken that we're getting these long dries. So we get a massive influx of water, gone. Doesn't hydrate the system, so the system has no resilience in there to grow plants and to build, and that's what natural sequence farming does. It creates that break point in there where the water is held for a little bit longer in the landscape to encourage more plants to grow so that you get the small water cycle functioning, so that you're bringing in dew, which is worth approximately 90 millimetres in rainfall per year, which is no short amount of moisture, which gets forgotten about entirely, that's coming back into your system every day, so long as you've got green growing plants.
Can you just say a bit more about the small water cycle? You talked about this at the presentation where I met you late last year as well, because I think this is a really key part, isn't it? Often when people talk about the water cycles, they're thinking about the big. You're talking about the dew, but there's also, like even with, tree crops and like this localized water cycle. Can you just tell us a bit more about that? Because I think it's a big part, like, as you're saying, it's a big part of this shift in thinking.
Oh, look, it's the major part. It's one of the key things we've completely missed, is that every drop of water that goes out of our landscape via a plant during the day comes back at night if the system is functioning, and that moderates the climate. So it's got a lot bigger effect than just bringing moisture back to your farm or your landscape. That's the key. That's what a farmer is probably thinking, well, if it's going to make more plants grow, then it's going to be beneficial to me. But it's beneficial to everybody. It's beneficial for all of the people out living on this planet that is functioning correctly, because the evapotranspiration through that small water cycle is also moderating the heat flux that we've got, which is causing all of this heat in the atmosphere and, elevating our issues with climate change. So if we get that functioning correctly, we're moderating the climate at the same time as making our landscapes more productive. It is just so simple. Mm-hmm. But the only way we can achieve that is that we must have green growing plants. We can't afford to be plant racists and determine that, we're just going to have this plant, we're just going to have that plant. No. We need every plant we can possibly get, and we need to get multi-stories of plants. This is the thing that you guys in permaculture are so far in front with, is that you're always focusing about the ecology, all these multi-layers of plants. Farmers should have picked up on that years ago. That's what they should be doing. Instead, we're still out there today hating trees, killing them, bulldozing them, burning them, whatever you want to do. And, we need all of that system to be working well. Sometimes you'll have too many trees. So for whatever reason, there's been some change to the landscape and there's been a whole heap of trees shoot up. Mm-hmm. And it limits the growth on the ground, which is affecting the farmer who needs the grass to be growing to feed his livestock. But rather than just go through and entirely annihilate the whole forest, they could do it more simply and easily. Well, not so much easier, because I guess it's easier to wipe out the whole lot. But they could do it more constructively, where they thin. So you've still got your canopy trees, you've still got your shrubs, and you've got your grasses, and they're all working in harmony as an ecosystem. Yeah. And possibly, maybe we couldn't run as many livestock. If we did it on a day basis, maybe we couldn't run as many livestock. But what if we could run that number of livestock for a longer period of time? Aha, now that's the kicker for you, because now you can run those livestock for a longer period of time, because you've got the other plant bringing the moisture back in to feed the grass, the fertility to come back in to feed the grass, which means now you can run the livestock, instead of for 6 months, you can run them for 10 months of the year. That number of livestock.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because often it's that factor of time that's not brought into it. Often the issues that we're facing, if we just took a broader time perspective, we would see these different patterns. And so I wonder, in terms of farmers' economy, have you worked out that actually makes it more financially viable for them to do it that way? Do you have any kind of evidence or figures for them? I mean, it makes sense, but does that give them better returns? Is that one of your arguments of how you can help talk with farmers about doing it differently? What are the things that you have farmers to change?
I don't go out of my way to tell farmers this is how much they're going to make, because it really depends on who it is, where's their head at this stage, what part of the journey they're on. all I simply say is the more the more moisture you get in your soil, the more nutrients you can capture in your soil, the more productive you will be. Now, I don't know where your landscape is at today as to what the production will be. But if you're growing more plants, you are more productive. Are you growing the plants that are going to make you more financially productive today? I do not know. I can't tell that because I can't see your individual property. The moment I go onto a place, I can determine for that person straight away where they're at. So I can look at the plants, look at the landscape, go, yep, that's where you're at. Yours, your property will potentially turn around in a year or two. You can go on to another place and go, I'd do something else. I wouldn't be focusing on running cattle on this landscape. It's not going to give you the returns that you need to make you viable. These are your options. These are other things that you can do that you've probably never thought about whilst that landscape is building. And that's what's really important. But are there productive increases? Most definitely there are. On Tarwin Park, you would see 1.5 to 2 times the amount of production of plants over any of the neighbouring places. They would irrigate, we didn't. So with no cost, no fertiliser, and 1.5 to 2 times more productive. That says enough for me, but I'm not saying that everybody is going to see the same results because it's got to determine where they're at in the cycle and more so where they're at in their own head. Mm-hmm. The thing that I find that makes it the most difficult for anybody, and look, we don't just have farmers, we have all sorts of people coming and doing our courses, but it's their head that's stopping them doing anything at all. So if we can get between here, the rest of it's easy. And once they start to believe that they're making a gain, that's when their real profits, that's when their real productivity comes in, because then they can't be stopped. Believing that what you're doing is right really goes a long way towards achieving exactly what the outcome you want.
So the evidence speaks for itself. And so I'm wondering, what kind of support is there to help get this work happening much more broadly than it already is? What is you've said that, the conditions in Australian farming landscapes need a lot of help. You have these examples of how you can turn things around, and in not a really long period of time either. What are the things that are currently helping in this transition, and what are the things that maybe are blocking that or need to be unstuck to help make this go like wildfire as it needs to go?
Well, I mean, some of it is what I said. It's what's going on in here. People can't get hold of something and take it unless they're ready to. And no amount of any change is going to change that. That's just the way it is. Either someone needs to change for some reason or another, whether it be financial reasons, not making enough money, or health, they want to do something better for themselves and for their landscape and for their family. They're the things that really make changes and change the way people think and why they want to do something differently. The holdbacks are that I think too many people want somebody else to pay, because potentially they didn't do the damage to the landscape. So in some ways they feel that it would be better if somebody else paid for it to be done. I don't believe that necessarily to be true. I think that if you are funding your own way, and if you can't afford very much, then you only do a little bit. But the little bit you do is yours, and you own it, and you're on a journey, and you are learning how it works. Now, part of the training program that we run, the big part of it is actually engaging people and giving them the ability to do it themselves, not have to go and rely on somebody else to do it for them. I don't think that is our future. if we've got to engage other people to do it for us, then I just don't think it will work.
I think that's a similarity with permaculture in a way. I mean, a lot of it is about, how can we see and understand the landscapes that are around us, and how can we restore them and bring them back to productivity and to be growing in abundance and to, bring the whole system to life. I mean, that's kind of what permaculture is about too. So there's a real correlation there, I think.
The two, there are too many things that don't fit together. Doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether permaculture is more about plants than anything else out there, and it's all plants. They're prepared to bring in all plants to create ecosystems. That marries very well with natural sequence farming. I'm no plant expert. You go out into the permaculture world and you'll find people out there in the permaculture world know 50,000 times more about plants than I know. But I know how to get our landscape back together so it functions. Then we bring in the skills of other people that know more about what plants to put in there, because farmers always think, you want to plant bloody trees on my place. But what I say is, what if those trees are fruit trees? What if they're nut trees? They can be producing you a product at the same time as doing all this other stuff. And so really what we're looking at is a marry between permaculture and NSF, because the production systems that you guys talk about fits in perfectly with what we talk about with the landscape. And then you can add the farmers' practices in that as well. So now you've got all of this stuff working together, and now you've got a whole heap of loopy farmers out there who are doing permaculture and natural sequence farming, and they never really thought they were going to, but they're still running their livestock and they're still growing crops. It's all possible. Sometimes it's a little bit too far out there for some people, but, I think that's changing. I think we're able to start building all of these pieces together so that it works beautifully together. And, anyway, that's the way I see it.
Yep. Well, my last question was really going to be about, what is it that you see that where we need to be going, and how, if you could envisage a world that was transitioned, to natural sequence farming, what did that look like? And is there anything that you could just throw in a few key things to make that change happen more rapidly? What would they be? So you kind of said the kind of world that you'd imagined. What are those key things you think, like if there was 2 or 3 things that we could be doing either at any scale? So something that like at a household scale or a farm scale to, is there anything like at a policy level that needs to shift, do you think? Or is it all about on farm?
Oh, look, let's start with the first part. What can we be doing on a household level and on a farm level? How do these two marry together? Well, that's a pretty big question, but I'll try not to get lost. I do tend to get a little bit lost at times with my answers. If we start to manage our water, so even on a household level, if we can have little contours in that manage how quickly the water leaves our landscape, so we can hydrate our piece of land before it goes, so it doesn't go into the storage, the drainage lines of the town or the city and then run away. So that's first. The next thing is, as a result of that, we want to grow as many plants as possible. So we want our backyards to be growing a huge diversity of plants. That can be food plants if you want. If you don't want food plants, then just grow plants for the environment. Doesn't matter. But the more green plants you've got, the more you affect the small water cycle, and the more you cool the climate. So now you're playing your part. If you want to, for the householder in town, if they choose more wisely in how they purchase their food, they've now got the ability to change the way farmers think about farming. So think about buying food that is produced in a way that is building the landscape. So if you're doing that, now you're encouraging more farmers to do exactly that, because farmers only do what the market demands. If the market demands cheap shit food, farmers can produce it. If the consumer demands maybe slightly more expensive but better quality and a better outcome for the landscape food, The farmer will produce it. Now, you'll notice I didn't mention governments in there. And there's a key reason for that. That those two, and it starts with the consumer, that those two at that level, wherever you want to call it, they are actually the leaders. So the consumer has all the power, but they don't realise it. The farmer can create all of the change, doesn't realise it. The government do nothing. All they do is follow those other two. So if the consumer keeps demanding cheap food, the government will ensure that they get cheap food. If the consumer says, we want our landscapes looked after and we want better quality food, we're happy to pay a little bit more for it, not excessive, but a little bit more, then the government will do that as well. So, those two people, wherever you put them, at the top or the bottom, doesn't matter. They're the ones that are going to create change for today or for the future, not anybody else. And that comes back to the question you asked me before about how do we fund this? Because so people want to go to government for funding. The trouble is government have no appetite to fund this because the consumer hasn't told them that that's what they want. If the consumer drives it like they should, the consumer then drives the government to fund the right things, which is about building landscapes, making landscapes function better to produce better quality food so that we're not propping people up on drugs to keep them alive. We feed them food that keeps them alive. That's a big difference. But the consumer holds all the power. They're the ones that need to change.
So I agree. And so my next question was, where do we get consumer change? Like, how do we influence more consumer change at a level that is at the pace that it's needed? Because there's a growing awareness, a huge growing awareness, but not quite enough yet. Any ideas on how to get that amplified?
I don't, unfortunately, have the answers to everything. And that one,
sorry, I thought you were doing pretty well.
That one I don't have the answers for, but I'll tell you what we do. So we run our training program. That's one. The other thing we run is our farming business called Forage Farms up in Queensland. So we produce pastured products, pastured eggs, pastured poultry, pastured pork, or grass-fed lamb and grass-fed beef. That gives us the contact with the consumer. So that's bringing the consumer through food back to the landscape. I can only affect the consumers that buy from us, which is very, very, very small. My vision would be that if we can influence enough farmers to run farms like this, then we can start to scale it out so that we can have more change. And there's a number of farms around like ours that are doing just that. I don't know that they're delivering the message that I'm delivering. They're probably more about producing a better quality food. Maybe they're not quite tying it back with everything that I see, where we can influence how our landscape's managed as a result. Outside of that, I don't really know what we do. I don't know. I mean, that's where the permaculture movement has been really good, because they've got a greater number of people. They are able to deliver a message. I think if there was any criticism to come from it, would be that in the past, a lot of the permaculture people have been described as being on the fringe, which they probably were in the early days. And so they weren't able to grab the hearts and minds of everybody, which is unfortunate, because the ability to create change, we would already be there by now. We wouldn't be still talking about it. And so I guess in a way, that's where our message can fit in as like the go-between. Still extreme, but maybe not as extreme as the permy type message. Although I will say that things have changed a lot in the permaculture movement over the last 20 years. There's a lot more, I don't know what you want to call them, mainstream people that are in that perming world, which is really, really good. So that's all helped create that change. All of that work that started way back when That's what's got us to where we are today. We've got to go, well, how do we scale it up? How do we get it to where we need it to be? And outside of doing what I said, where we scale this again, I don't know, Morag, really what else. Influencing government is a potential, but it's mind-numbing, and I really couldn't be bothered, to tell you the truth, because everything I've seen over the years is you spend most of your time banging your head up against the wall and not actually achieving anything. I think
go ahead.
The latest issue that we've had with COVID-19, I think, as bad as that's been, that will create more change than anything. And unfortunately, that's what it takes. When our ecosystem breaks down, these are the things we start to see happening. And if people realise that that's directly related back to how we look after our landscapes, that's going to affect their health, like directly affect their health, not affect their health in 30 years' time. That's going to affect their health today. And that's, I think, how the universe or nature, whatever you want to call it, that's how it's trying to teach us a lesson. If we don't learn from this, I think we are doomed. We are destined for, for not being on this planet for much longer. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, what have you noticed in forage farms in terms of your business? I was talking to Food Connect down in Brisbane. They said their business just took off during COVID because people were looking for something that was more local, more resilient, was actually, feeding this system. There was like a sense of alarm bells going off everywhere, and people were waking up. And even though once things settled down a bit, it dropped again, but it still was above what it was before. Have you experienced something similar with your food system?
Yeah, yes, I think so. Well, particularly our eggs, because we have much more exposure with our eggs. They're over. That's probably at this stage the biggest part of our farming business here. So where our eggs fluctuated a lot more in volume, it's stabilised considerably more, gone up more. I think that's probably a little bit around that, people wanting to buy more local, better quality produce. We're not there with our meat yet. I think that's still a very growing side of our business. So I imagine it will probably end up the same position as the eggs. I mean, since late last year, we were struggling to keep up with our egg supply to all all of our customers. Where in the 3 years prior, I think we donated to Oz Harvest thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of eggs over that period of time. One, because we demand to have high quality, so unless we're getting the freshest quality out there, we don't send it. So we donate it so that somebody else that can use it, so it doesn't go to waste. But yeah, we don't even have that, except for maybe our young birds' eggs. Everything else seems to be going, and so I think there's probably two levels to it. One, more exposure. More people know that we're here, and two, people looking at what can they buy locally. But I still think we've got off very lightly with COVID so far, particularly in Queensland. I don't think there's been anywhere near the setbacks that even New South Wales or Victoria have seen. And so I do fear that we're yet to get our side of that. We've got off unscathed fairly well. I hope it doesn't happen, but at the same time, I suspect we really probably need it to wake people up, and so through through adversity. Well, I can't think what the saying is, but anyway, you know what I'm saying. So through a crisis of some form, we'll get our shit together, really.
Yep. And coming back to what you just said before about, where does the change happen? Well, it changes by getting your system working really well, so that it's just singing, and people can see that, people can experience it, they can see that that whole systems approach is making a huge difference by sharing the stories of the examples, like you're saying, like through a drought you get that extra 6 years. I mean, that's phenomenal. Like when you hear these stories, when you see it, when it's this palpable, tangible difference that can be made, you don't, the scaling is maybe not necessarily important. It's about amplifying what you do at each of the small steps, and making those connections, and having people like the permaculture movement pick those stories up and spread them out through the community too as well. So just as a final thing, I did say a final thing before, a final thing, how do people find out about you, your courses, your farm, get in touch with you? Are there particular links that you'd like to send people to? I can put them down in the show notes below, but did you want to mention anything just now?
Well, our training course is called Tarwyn Park Training, TARWYN Park Training. So if you go onto there, we have a website, but just Google that and our training program will pop up. And then, of course, we've got Forage Farms, which is just put in Forage Farms. And once again, they'll pop up. My eldest son, Hamish, he's in charge of our websites. He's done all the work towards building our websites and all of our meat box sales, which can all be done online. He's done all of that. And in actual fact, he's done a lot of work to the training course as well, a lot of our material, which I think is really important, because although this all seems logical to me and probably seems logical to you, to the average person, they struggle to get hold of it. As simple as it seems to be hard to get hold of. And I find that when I speak, I sometimes speak on a level that seems to be above what other people can handle, even though it isn't. It's really simple, but it's the way it's perceived, the way it comes across. So Hamish, being involved in writing the material, he's 22. So he now speaks on the same level as the people that I'm speaking to. So they get this information, makes a lot more sense to them, because it's written by somebody who is akin to them, not somebody who's been around this for 30 years or whatever. And I think that's really important. But anyway, so they're the two areas that you can get in contact. We run courses all over Australia. I think this year we've got set down to do 16 or 17 courses, which is stupid. It's too many. I wasn't planning on running that many, but people just, I'm very bad at saying no. People say, "Oh, could you come and run a course here?" I go, "Oh, yeah, no worries, all right." And then I just keep saying yes all the time, which I probably should say no, because it's a bit difficult. But anyhow, there you go. That's what we do. So we also run tours on the farm at Forage Farms, and Hamish and our other son Lachlan, they both work on the farm, or they pretty much run the farm. They run the tours once again, because they speak at the level that the people that are there, because there's kids there and mums and dads and so forth. So people can come to a tour at Forage Farms. They'll learn about not only the animals and what we do, but natural sequence farming as well. And they'll learn from the boys, and they'll get to see it as they go. Yeah. So, and look, I love questions. I love people asking me questions. And if I know the answer, I will give the answer. If I don't know the answer, I'll endeavour to find out. And the boys are the same. So that's all about just delivering information as clearly as possible, so that people can take it home and do something with it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to answer my questions and to be here exploring permaculture and natural sequence farming. It's just been absolutely delightful to spend this time with you again today, and hopefully I'll come and visit you soon up at the farm. Bring my family along. That would be great.
You're more than welcome. More than welcome. And thank you for actually asking me to join in. I mean, I'm up for a chat anytime. I'm told by my family that I talk too much, and that's probably true. But it's the only way you really get the message out is by talking. I'll talk to anybody. I'll talk to a brick wall if I wanted to listen. But that's the way you get the message out. And, it's interesting. It's funny how the universe works. But we were in town earlier, and I went to the cafe to we got a coffee, and the lady that was serving us was the lady that arranged that talk that you and I gave.
Yeah, wow.
How's that amazing?
Yes.
The day that I'm doing the talk with you, I meet her at a cafe. There you go.
So, there you go. Well, it's been so great to chat, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks for taking the time, and good luck with all your 17 courses, and I hope your family's all set up for you. I know what it's like, when you start traveling off around the countryside and, like everyone has to kind of hold fort while you're away.
Yeah. I mean, we've been at this now for this farm for 4 years. Mm-hmm. So for the first couple of years, it was training everybody, including myself, how this operation worked. And I've been running the training courses since 2012. So that's a little bit older hat, I guess. But yeah, getting the younger generation trained up, I don't have to worry about going away. For this year now, Megan can travel with me, which is nice.
Fantastic.
So she can do everything she needs to do. She does all of the accounts and the ordering and everything for the business, and she can do that remotely. So she gets to travel with me, which is good. So she gets to see other parts of the country, and the boys get to run the farm without their parents getting in the way, which is always positive, because I was never given that opportunity when I was a young fella to do that. And I just want them to grab hold of it and run with it and do whatever they can do. Look, everybody makes mistakes, and the only way you ever learn, unfortunately, is by making them. All we can do is hopefully minimise the serious mistakes and leave it to the more simple mistakes. So, and I'd say that they don't make many mistakes at all. So, that's all part of my philosophy as well. They're on a journey, and, I just want to help them on their journey. So, anyway.
Awesome, Dad.
Thank you very much for your time. And, we'll talk again, I'm sure.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Stuart. Take care. See you later.
Yeah.
Bye. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Head on over to my YouTube channel, the link's below, and then you'll be able to watch this conversation, but also make sure that you subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all new films that come out, and also you'll get notified of all the new interviews and conversations that come out. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.